Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. Today, we are going to talk about an all-the-above energy solution happening here in the East Bay, and we're going to talk to the folks from the Western States. I am joined by Bob Brown and Mark Necadome to talk about how their industry is impacting the community in the East Bay. What are the economics and how are we transitioning to the future in our economy? But thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. Bob, starting with you, do you want to give an intro? Then we'll let Mark provide an intro.
I'm Bob Brown with Western States Petroleum Association. Been with this Energy Trade Association for 8 years now. My background spans both government service, but also 17 years at AAA, the Auto Club, where we talked about transportation and traffic safety, and then transition to the energy more region, explore, produce, refine, transport energy, petroleum-based products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, safely, reliably to all of us. It's an important conversation because whether it's utilities or energy, we take it for granted. We turn the light on, the lights come on, or we start our car to go from point A to point B or have goods and services delivered. We rely very much on it for transportation fuels and for what petroleum products make up in our society, our daily lives. Pleasure to be here today, Jared.
Mark Necadome. I'm the Senior Director for Science and Technology, or Nerd-in-Chief at Western States Petroleum Association. I've only been there about 4.5 years, came from a long career in government, research scientist in the federal government as an academic, bring a strong and diverse science background to it, but I'm also experienced in the policy world, having been a political appointee under Bush, Obama, Jerry Brown, and Steve Bullock in Montana. My portfolio at WISPA has been focused on the research behind many of the comments we make on regulatory processes, how we approach statutory advocacy. I've worked with major universities like Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, Lawrence Livermore, in gaining traction within our organization. I think in the last few years, we've been much more scientifically grounded. Not that we haven't been in the past, but we're more forward with that grounding. I'm just delighted that I got this role toward the end of my career.
I appreciate both of you sharing a little bit more about yourselves. Let's talk about the economic impact here in the East Bay, where this podcast airs. The number of refineries, the number of workers, the number of high-paying jobs. Talk a little bit about that and give us a picture, Bob.
In the Bay Area, there are 5 facilities, 4 in Contra Costa. This is traditionally refineries. Two of those 5, there's 4 in Contra Costa County and 1 in Solano County. Major companies, Valero, Chevron, Phillips 66, Marathon, and Martinez Refining Company, which is part of PBF and formerly Shell. Been operating in the Bay Area for, in some cases, over 100 years. These are legacy industries, and certainly they've been evolving, but the jobs contribution, the last study that we commissioned, and we're updating that actually in the next month or two, 150,000 direct jobs in the state. And when you look at indirect and induced jobs, that jumps to about 350,000. In the Bay Area, that equates to 26,686 Bay Area residents directly employed by the oil and gas industry. That's a huge impact to the county coffers in terms of tax revenue and contributions, the local businesses where these employees live and work. And I started to say that oil and gas, it constitutes 3 of those 5 Bay Area facilities. 2 of the facilities more recently are now into renewable diesel generation, and it's significant part of the energy mix that you talked about. I think the demand for our products, 7 million gallons of diesel in the state every day, 1 million gallons of jet fuel. California is the largest user of jet fuel in the United States. 35 million gallons of gasoline daily. The renewable diesel portion, which is your vegetable oils and used fats and greases that are turning into the renewable product that two of our facilities are producing. That's very much a part of the forward-looking energy mix. The day-to-day reliance that consumers have for the traditional product is very strong today with consumer demand, and it's going to be for a very long time into the future.
And within those 26,000 plus jobs here in the East Bay, those aren't entry level fast food worker wage jobs. These are well paying jobs that people can earn a good living on. Can you shed a
Yeah.
little?
No, they're career jobs. One thing we've spent time on is focusing on for a long time on STEM education, but just the importance of the skilled trades workforce and the community colleges in the East Bay, Los Medanos College in particular, with their programs, but all of them really creates a career rather than just a job. Those direct jobs that I referenced earlier are an average of $85,000 a year and up. And these are engineers, chemists, electricians, plumbers, steam fitters. We work very closely with the building trades in producing and delivering our products to the consumer. It's a career that people look for and train for, and they're good opportunities to support the community. Many of our employees stay there a long time because they are indeed very good jobs, paid, rewarding, and these folks want to continue to deliver safe and reliable transportation, and they care about the communities they live and work in.
You mentioned tax revenue for the counties. For the refineries or Contra Costa One in Solano, do you have any more information about those tax revenue generations?
I think it's something like 1 in 5 county tax dollars come from our industry. It's significant, 3.4 billion in state and local tax revenue. These are things that our companies, whether it's property tax revenue or other, it really invests quite a bit. And if you look at the operations, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, we fund in large part 17 million in fees annually to that agency to operate. And they regulate us. And there's some 30 agencies at the federal, state, and local level that regulate us. It's a significant amount that they invest in the communities as well. Each company, the communities, the cities, and the counties they work in invest quite a bit in community-based programs, in education, certainly in the agencies, but the tax revenue in general.
I think that's good. And I might circle back to the nonprofits later. Think about the impact of that. That's 20%. If you lost 20% of your salary, that's significant. It really is a major impact. And that trickles down. While it's 26,600 something jobs, there's indirect impacts. All of those people buy lunch, they buy groceries in these communities. They're contributing with their spouses and kids are in school. It's just a significant dollar amount.
And I'll add too, Jared, that we talked about the county. In many of these cases, whether it's the city of Richmond for Chevron, or the city of Benicia for Guero, or the city of Martinez for the Martinez Refining Company, to some extent, Marathon as well, city coffers are definitely, and city-based benefit from the refineries being there and from refinery workers contributing to the local economy.
Let's talk about the growth, right? Some of these, like the Chevron refinery, has been there pre-World War II in Richmond, and Richmond has grown up around that. Recently, the city of Richmond and other cities have looked to take measures, almost trying to push these companies out, making it harder for them to operate. Any thoughts on those? And you don't have to talk specifically about Chevron, but just generally, what is a message that these cities should have in this process?
All of our member companies want to be good stewards of the environment and good partners in the community. I think they've proven that over the years. It's a very complex industry that we're in. We're a big part of the regulated community, but I'll just take the Air District, for example. They have some 11,000 permittees that they regulate. We're a huge chunk, the bigger industry players. Regulation is important. I've testified to this at agency hearings where you look at the improvement we've made over in air quality, for example, and water quality over the last 20 to 25 years. You can certainly credit some of the agencies and the laudable goals have regulations to achieving some of that, but it takes two to partner in achieving those benefits. And the regulated entities are all about compliance. If there's a rule in the public domain, we weigh in on the process as it's going through and give our point of view of how it could be a more effective regulation. By the same token, you don't want to overregulate or regulate some of these important companies that have been in these communities for generations and doing a good job. I think it's important to be a partner, to have a voice at the table and weigh in on these.
If you'll permit me, I'd like to add a little bit of color to what Bob was saying about
Please.
regulation as a former regulator myself, not just in the oil and gas industry, but across in Montana, I had 21 different regulatory programs, including pesticides and water quality. And depending on the industry, maybe 1 or 2% of the industry is scofflaw. The other 98 to 99% really are trying to do a good job. They make mistakes. Sometimes they misunderstand the regulations, and sometimes the regulators themselves misunderstand their own regulations. Part of my job, especially as a political appointee responsible for a department, would often be to make sure that our people are not overreaching based on the best science, that they're technically sound and not capricious or whimsical, which often happens in government. Bob does a great job of explaining how our companies, which are major players in the economy, are actually fairly eager to get ahead of the curve on the regulatory process and really want to be at the table as regulations are being contemplated, not necessarily when the hammer drops and the rulemaking process starts. Most of these regulations in this industry are highly technical, and they require a broad level of knowledge about what it is you're regulating and the potential unintended consequences of a given rule. A little color as a former bureaucrat myself.
That's good context. Mark, I want to talk about this renewable fuels transition that two of the facilities have gone through recently. What is that transition? What does it mean to those refineries? What does it mean to the economy? And where is it used?
To your question about renewable diesel and other fuels, the key driver here is reductions in greenhouse gases. This is not about anything else fundamentally. Many people mistake or don't understand that this is not about transforming the transportation system or inventing new EVs. It's about reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. It's a very serious problem. Our industry understands that. It's a significant portion of global GDP. We understand the necessity of reducing greenhouse gases. It's very expensive to generate alternative liquid fuels that are either the source of direct combustion for an engine, a power plant, or they're actually the generators for the electricity that EVs use. The entire transportation system is highly dependent still on fossil fuel energy. The question is, for every mile driven, for every dollar of GDP, how do we make sure that the carbon intensity is continually going down? The low carbon fuel standard, which you've seen in the press more recently because of the update in the regulations, is aiming toward what we believe is a correct goal. Can you stimulate technical and economic innovation and major investment in lower carbon solutions? We're still going to drive an economy. And we don't want to lose track of that. That's one of the macro parts of what Bob put here about how the industry makes major contributions, some of which are not necessarily countable economically. While the industry contributes 5% of the GDP in California, it's foundational to just about every sector, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, even services. So remember that when we talk about more virtuous cycles of renewable diesel development, Marathon and P66 didn't convert those refineries just because they became more virtuous. They became more sensible economically as the regulatory framework changed and the economic incentives made sense as a corporate strategy. We also finished a major study, and I'll give you the acronym first because it sounds like Neapolitan ice cream. It's called TESCI, but it actually means Transportation Energy Supply Chain Infrastructure and Investment Study. One of the findings by the consultants that did the research for this, Turner Mason and Company, was that high likelihood that renewable diesel would overtake the entire road diesel market by the end of 2026.
That's very soon.
But what that means, and this is something I think some of your listeners might be quite interested in, is when you're refining a barrel of crude oil, you only have so much margin you can play with. That barrel of 42 gallons is going to produce about 60% gasoline, about 15% fossil diesel, and then the other parts of natural gas liquids and all kinds of other things that come out of a barrel. You don't really have a whole lot of choice. If you're going to refine a barrel, you're going to get diesel. Where's that diesel going to go when the economic incentives for renewable diesel have taken hold so completely that it's hard to sell it in the state of California? Our members are very conscious of this. They knew from the beginning that the refining industry in California was going to end up with several hundred thousands of extra, you could say, fossil diesel, and that they have been looking for options, and companies are very different for antitrust reasons. We can't know their strategies, but we are aware that they know that the very ports that are now being congest importation of additional refined product or additional crude are going to be where we're competing to move diesel offshore. And that was a little great column on the side of trivia that might be really important for your folks to understand as you're looking at the better solution by producing renewable diesel. It's not free and it's not somehow more environmentally benign, except that it has a lower greenhouse gas profile and lower carbon intensity.
And I think it's important to note that there's a lot of discussion in the political world. More recently, you could argue that these issues have become more political in nature than they should be. We want to continue to be a voice at the table because they talk about an energy transition and just transition. Our thought is that the innovation and investment in whatever transition there is contained within the workforce in our industry. You're seeing that in two of our facilities, but also all of them have investments in renewables, which they utilize at their companies and certainly are forward looking that way. And I think it's important to note that it is going to take an all of the above energy strategy with traditional oil and gas being a major part of that portfolio for a long time to come. There is nowhere more regulated than in California and in the Bay Area in terms of our product. And this is the most stringent air quality, water quality regulations anywhere in the world. No one makes this fuel and delivers it cleaner and safer. The issue is that there's a cost to that. You have the low carbon fuel standard, you have cap and trade, you have the energy island because there's no pipelines delivering the product in. We produce what we can, and there's limitations there, which we can get into. The rest we have to import from other countries that don't share our environmental and labor standards. All of that is to say there's a price tag to that. There's a cost to comply. These are laudable goals, not saying that they are goals we shouldn't aspire to, but you also have to look at the market, what people are able to afford. And that's the delicate balancing act that we're doing.
I don't like when gas prices got to $6, $7 a gallon here in the Bay Area. That was ridiculous to fill up in my minivan. Let's talk about one of those big regulatory goals, 2035 EV charging, something that the Air Resource Board has put forth, waiting on federal compliance guidelines. What should people know about that and relate it to the oil and gas industry? How will it affect the economy we were talking about here?
I'll let Mark talk to some of the goals, the timelines, and realistic expectations. But I'll just say people like choices. A lot of these rules put out there, again, with laudable goals in mind, those that can least afford to buy an electric vehicle or that rely on their gas-powered car or truck to get long distances to and from work in the Bay Area, maybe have to live further out from where their job is. And they can't afford not only the electric vehicle, but also the ability to charge it, the infrastructure there to support that. It isn't quite there yet. It's not to say let's just create another government program to have a pool of money that they can apply for. You have to look at the overall consumer marketplace and what people can afford in terms of what they drive. We're all about consumer choices and all of the above energy strategy, as we discussed. But these are aggressive goals. California versus the rest of the nation probably leads by a long shot in terms of people purchasing electric vehicles, but the average car stays in a family's hands for a good 11 years. And so it's going to take a long time to flip over that fleet. And 2035 is certainly coming. We'll be here before we know it, but there's stages of this goal, 2026 and before 2035, that have been put out in regulation and laws. It's aggressive. And I think we'll collectively have to look at where we are in the marketplace, in the technology, and the ability of our charging stations network to meet those goals. I'll let Mark speak to some of those 2035, 2040 goals, 2045.
I would remind folks that the current transportation infrastructure is supported by over 10,000 gas stations across the state. The amount of fuel in reserve at those gas stations. And we all know that the typical range of a combustion powered vehicle is 2 to 3 times an electric vehicle. It's important to understand that if we're going to move to 100% electric vehicle, you have to move, assuming that you want the economy to run roughly in 20 years as robustly as it is now. You're going to have to replace the equivalent of 10,000 gas stations with an adequate charging infrastructure that doesn't leave people stranded. When you drive up to the Shell station, for example, throw your credit card in, it almost always works, unless there's a little yellow bag over the nozzle, right? In recent studies of EV charging performance in California outside of the Tesla networks, about 58%. You're highly likely to roll up, if you got a Kia, to roll up to a charging station and either the credit card system doesn't work, the charging is down, or whatever, it's not working. That's the other part of what Bob was saying earlier. The grid infrastructure required to make this work is robust. Our recent study with Stanford, using the CARB scoping plan as the base case, showed that we would have to triple or 5 times the current grid to meet the electrification goals. If you've followed how long it takes to get a power line in, or moving electrons from where they're generated to where they're used, the last example was in San Diego with the Sunrise Line. It took over 12 years. It's not promising our current performance in terms of building out the grid. The other part is the use case. I'm really excited to see the demographics of EV owners for whom that EV is the primary vehicle. My working hypothesis would be that the EV is actually the third car. And what that says to me is the use case for EV is completely legitimate. I would buy an EV if I had a similar use case, commuting short distances, charging while at work and all that. Great. I think it's a smashingly good idea. However, most people don't operate that way. And I come from growing up in background in farming and ranching up in the Pacific Northwest. And I can tell you most of my family are still very about the ability for EVs to meet the needs of the agriculture and ranching community. That's just one example. The infrastructure, the grid build out, all of those things are major hurdles for us to overcome. They're not insuperable, but it's probably $1 trillion plus in California to get to that point.
Elon Musk's couch cushion change sounds like he could afford that trillion. And I think people have to realize you're changing an economy, all of those gas stations. We're talking time, like you said, we're talking 2045, 2050, before they would have to start closing the doors. But then you have the real estate that goes into that. You have sites that have gasoline under them and have to be cleaned before you could put anything in them. Those create jobs. There's mechanic shops that change, and there's a lot that really goes into it. It is a major economic impact. We had an episode with PG&E a couple of weeks ago where they were talking about why it's taking so long and how much more money they needed from the state to speed up the permit process, trench digging, and all of that. I want to circle back to the oil industry, though. And talk about a little bit more what you were saying, Mark, and how does that fit into a transitional economy where gas and oil is still part of it in that energy above context?
When we say all of the above, we really mean all of the above. We're talking about technical and economic feasibility. I kicked the tires on a lot of innovative energy technology. I can tell you that most of it is squirming at the bottom of the valley of death. There's a reason for that because innovation and investment basically goes forward as robustly as possible, but uptake in technical feasibility is a relatively small percent. Not a single ethanol plant built in the 1980s is still operating because the technology and the economics have changed. It would be the same for any technological transformation solution. Many people think of it as overinvestment, but it is the nature of that technological transformation that you'd have to spend a lot of money. The rate of return on capital has to be reasonable enough for the uptake to be real. The oil industry is quite used to this. The oil industry has been innovating for 100 years. Cars have changed, technology's changed, regulations have changed, and all of them have prompted new investment. Some of that investment doesn't have much of an ROI. This is where we can expect. It shouldn't be like a declaration of failure by any means. You can expect a number of things to simply not work and not return that investment. However, the broader bulk of that transformation is going to happen. Oil and gas is going to drive much of the energy economy, particularly in transportation, for a very long time. Part of it is just the simple physics of energy density. Humanity has not yet found something like petroleum that in a couple of cubic meters, you get a lot of BTUs of energy out of it, and you can harness it. Fusion, I'm very hopeful for. I'm toward the end of my career, so it's not going to happen before I retire. But I'm very hopeful that we will find incredible innovations in material sciences, in our ability to capture carbon out of the atmosphere so that we can continue to combust and then capture the results of that combustion. We've done it with catalytic converters. There's no reason we can't do it at mass scale with other materials as well.
I think we need market-based solutions. The last few years have been more of bans and mandates dictating the direction and letting politics supersede science and data and the ability to continue to innovate. As Mark was saying, you can invest in all energy infrastructure to meet these goals. But I think you also need market-based solutions. You need to acknowledge where maybe the technology is, but its ability to be delivered through manufacturing and route to the consumer ultimately. There may be problems that there's permits too. That's a huge issue, not only for our industry, but the ability to get permits in a timely fashion. It's holding up projects that could meet some of these aggressive goals. And it's hurting the very goals it's trying to encourage. Having a responsive government that works well with the regulated community, I think is important. I know it's got a role to play, but there also needs to be the ability to be in a sensible economic environment with realistic expectations and the ability to thrive with innovation.
And that permit issue, going back to the power issue, is the same problems that housing is having in California. Getting the permits, going through the process fast enough, getting through CEQA is a big issue. Bob, we use the phrase all of the above energy solutions. Talk about that from a national security perspective and help define that as well as from an economic. What does it mean to you?
I think in terms of solar, nuclear, traditional gas and oil, hydrogen, you do have to look at multiple solutions. There's environmental challenges with anything. The land mass needed for solar panels is an issue. The ability to recycle batteries properly is an important issue. I'm just talking in terms of what we all know to be challenges. We all want to ultimately have a clean environment. And so I think it's important to have energy independence. We're the number 3 user in the world in terms of our product in California, behind only the United States and China. I think it's important to acknowledge that and be able to deliver it properly, safely, environmentally sound. And it's just an important global issue, certainly. that's got a lot of economic legs to it. In terms of the utility industry, certainly with solar power, I have solar at my house. It keeps our energy bill down to a very reasonable monthly rate. In terms of energy storage and delivery, at nighttime, when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, there's limitations to anything, but they all can play a part. It's a team effort. In terms of storage and delivery, it is a challenge. We could touch on carbon capture and sequestration. That's a technology that's very promising, but also very expensive. You need permits to deliver on that as well. To meet the aggressive climate goals we have in the state, carbon capture has to be a part of it. But I think overall, there's a number of different innovations that are going to be important. We need to be a state and a country that encourages innovation and to be a leader around the world. What we can achieve in California in terms of air quality improvements is 1% of the global greenhouse gas. I'll let Mark add to anything that I might have missed.
I think you pretty much covered it, Bob. I would also emphasize CCS, carbon capture and storage, which is politically controversial for some people.
If you're taking the carbon out of the atmosphere from the refineries, talk about what that process is, and then help me understand, why do some of the environmental groups actually oppose that?
I'll start with your latter question. I think there's a fundamental hostility to combustion, and there's an additional hostility to combustion of fossil fuels. So I think that's a kind of an ideological problem we have. Most of the well-being and energy we enjoy on the planet these days is due to combustion. If you don't like combustion, you're not going to like any solution to the combustion problem. The combustion problem is a 30 billion ton a year problem. And that is huge. That is basically what we are producing in greenhouse gas emissions over and above the natural cycling between atmosphere and the surface of the earth. So we have to solve that problem. Now, one way to solve that problem, and the technology is not mysterious, it's actually well proven. We've got 40 years of experience scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. You'd prefer to scrub it out of a stack where you're doing combustion rather than just scrubbing it right out of the atmosphere. The concentration is something like 100 times greater in stack emissions versus the atmosphere. It makes more sense to grab it before it gets into the atmosphere. The storage of it is stored because we're putting it in the place where it has been for several, in some cases, 100 million years. But it hasn't leaked out. Natural gas, oil, it's been sitting in geological formations until, well, about 100 and some years ago, we said, look at this, and we can blow it up and do things with it. But it has basically been sitting there for a very long time. And the technology for injection and storage is simply compressing and moving it back into the geological formations from which it came. It's not that mysterious. I think a number of people are very concerned that somehow we don't know what we're doing and that we're going to cause these massive leaks of CO2 into the atmosphere. That could happen, of course, because as a former regulator, I know that upset happens, especially in large industries. You want to minimize those risks, but you're not going to lose several 100 million tons of CO2 out of storage without noticing. The technology, and I'm talking as a scientist now, is well proven. We know where the geology is. California itself has such a unique geology that California could store almost all of the global emissions for the next 100 years. It's got that much storage space that we've already assessed and assayed, and we know where the geology is stable and where it's not. It's a solution we could move to very quickly if we had political alignment and some agreement. But as Bob says, the permitting process is relatively new. That is, US EPA in the United States has the sole authority to authorize the injection of gases. Some states have the authority to work with EPA to do that. But we're in the infancy of that kind of injection of CO2, transport and injection of CO2. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's going to be a lot of investment and a lot of permitting.
I want to ask about pricing. Help a consumer that is listening understand, why does gas go from $4 to $6 and then back to $4.50 a gallon. Just help us understand what is going on in the marketplace shifting around up and down.
Sure. Bob, I'll jump right in because we've been looking at this very carefully, obviously, in both an economics and technical issue, but also as an advocacy issue. We're trying to help our regulators understand why there's so much variability in the market and why the market becomes more or less volatile. Think of it this way. If we were visual here and I could pop it up, I would use what we call placemat, which is actually a bunch of icons that we put together on an 11 by 17 laminated piece of paper that shows you where all of the sources of energy are, how it gets to where it's used in demand. Now, the movement of oil from where it's produced out of the ground to retail involves thousands of transactions. Somebody's making an investment decision about the price of oil. Price of oil is, of course, set by global commodity rates. When it gets to refining, you have a lot of overhead. It's a whole lot more expensive to operate any industry in California, and it's very expensive to operate a refinery in California. You named some of them already: real estate, labor, environmental controls. That's a cost center that some variation happens to. But when we have a constrained market, an illiquid market would be the economic way of talking about it. When we're short on supply, a trader is going to look at what's happening across the globe in transportation. What is the crude supply? How likely am I going to be able to buy this today and sell it tomorrow? Retailers at gas stations are always making economic decisions about, can I get my contract met? How much is it going to cost me? Do I need to hustle a little bit? Are the traders going to do a little bit of a markup because it's looking like we might come into short supply? There's a whole lot of things that are happening at once that then result in the sign at the gas station go up or down in price.
I think you look at some things that are unique to California. You've got the reformulated fuel that came into effect in 1994. You've got the summer-winter blend shift. It is largely on supply and demand. You also got about $1.30 or so in mostly state taxes and regulations. There's some federal in there at 19 cents. Those have all been cost drivers that have been going in the upward directions. About $1.30 right off the top in taxes and regulations. And then you've got the energy island that we're in. No pipelines coming in. There's an extra constraint like we have right now in permitting. About 25% of our oil comes from in-state and the rest we have to import by ship. That's very expensive. It can take a long time. You've got more regulations coming on the books. January 1, the Air Resources Board passed, talk about port electrification, the freight. There's a lot of costs that impact ultimately the price of the product.
You want to share about the work you're doing or the refineries are doing?
Yeah, I think overall the ability to do our jobs, to deliver safe and reliable fuels to the marketplace, represent a large workforce in the state, and have a product that people want. Let's make this a better place to do business, whether it's the Bay Area or California as a whole, to continue to innovate and achieve the goals that we want to achieve, but do it in a reasonable way and be able to have some regulations, a seat at the table and a voice at the table, and saying what's workable, what's ready. And there's some things that, hey, you as the regulator haven't thought about, just making it a more balanced work environment in California.
Mark?
Yeah, I just pick up right where Bob tapered off on the regulation side and the place at the table, having spent much of my career creating the table in many regulatory processes. California has become unique and largely hostile to having much of the expertise we need to make the right regulatory changes and choices. We've pretty much been excluded from the table. And that political hostility and the polarization has resulted in some poor decisions the state is making. I'll be very frank about that. And I'm not just being the WISPA advocate here. I think from a policy and policymaker perspective, California is making some major mistakes that could have irrevocable consequences, that could shut things down prematurely or cause market disruption in a way that doesn't have to happen if you're having the right kind of conversation with the industry you're regulating. So that's my bid as a regulator.
Mark Necadome and Bob Brown from the Western States Petroleum Association. I appreciate you both being here with me today. Thank you.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.